Now that we're starting to get familiar with creating sketches, let's start from scratch and look at a few more sketch tools. We're going to start a new part, selecting our part millimeter template, and start a new sketch on the top plane. By now you should be pretty comfortable with following this process of creating a new file and starting a new sketch. Now inside here we're going to start by sketching a rectangle. We're going to use a center point rectangle, and we're going to add construction lines either from corners or from midpoints. We're going to go ahead and place this rectangle and add a few dimensions. We'll make the top 125 millimeters wide and the side 100 millimeters tall. Now the first tool that we want to take a look at is going to be in the Move Entities dropdown. Now inside here there are several tools. The main ones we're going to focus on are going to be Move Entities and Scale Entities inside of here. So let's start with Move Entities. The dialog's pretty straightforward. You have entities to move. So we're going to select all the entities that we want to move. You notice that we have a Keep Relations option. Now this is very important because things like vertical or horizontal relations on lines, perpendicular constraints and corners, things like that, you want to keep if you move an item. For parameters, we have options to do a from to, if we're selecting a point we want to move it from, or we can actually put in X and Y delta variables. Let's use the from to option, and for our starting point, we'll select the origin, and for our finish point, we'll just select somewhere in space. Now you'll notice that nothing happened. Nothing was actually able to move. Let's try this again. We'll select everything, and we'll use the XY option. Let's move it 50 millimeters in X and 150 millimeters in Y. And again, you notice nothing is happening here. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at our sketch. Now our sketch has some relations in the center. It's coincident with the origin. Now if we take that off, we're able to move this file around easily. So we don't have to use the Move Entities command if we're just moving the entire file around. But let's take another look at Move Entities. Again, let's select everything, except for this point. I'm going to deselect that point. I'm going to keep relations, and I'm going to move it. So you'll notice here, when I enter a value in X and Y, it is able to move them. Once we say OK, you notice the dimensions move as well, and the sketch itself moves to that new location. So the initial issue is the fact that we have a point at the center that had a coincident relation, and because we were manually selecting those points, it was leaving that behind and the relations were staying. So if we undo this, we put this back at the origin before we deleted any relations. Let's go ahead and use Move Entities one more time. This time I'm going to mass select, which selects point 1, the center point that is between the construction lines. In this case, it's the midpoint for construction lines that's coincident with the origin. Again, we're going to keep relations. Let's try to use this dialog again. So you'll notice that here again, once I enter a value, in this case 100 millimeters in X, 150 in Y, it's not moving. So it's locking the relation at the origin, and it's unfortunately keeping that relation and it's keeping it from moving. If I deselect Keep Relation, you notice that it moves it to the applicable spot and we're good to go. So once we say OK, it's really important to understand that the relations that we have relating our sketch entities to things like the origin can override some of these tools that we have. Let's take a look at the next option, Copy Entities. Now inside here, again, we're going to select everything. We'll keep relations, and this time we'll move it 150 in X and 150 in Y. We say OK, and now we have a complete copy of this. But you'll notice that it doesn't have dimensions. We have 100 millimeters here, 125 here, but this one is actually free to move and stretch around. So when you're using these tools, such as Move Entities or Copy Entities, it's important to note that even when you use Keep Relations, you're only keeping things like a horizontal relation on a line. You're not keeping the dimensions or anything like that. Now, in a case like this, we could simply select the upper horizontal line, Control select this line, and make them equal. Then we could select this line and make those equal as well. Now, as we move this around, it stays the same size. Now you might be wondering, why would I use these tools when I can simply move and drag and drop this? Well, that's a pretty good question, because in most cases, you don't need to use these tools. The only time you should really consider using something like Move Entities or Copy Entities, if you need to move a specific amount of location of, let's say, a hole on your part, and you don't currently have a dimension for it, or you don't have any other geometry to relate it to, sometimes it's a good idea to use tools like Move Entities or Copy Entities to relocate that. In most cases, you're not going to be using these because you can free drag these parts around and then simply add dimensions as needed. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be Mirror Entities. Now, this is a very handy tool, especially when you're using some of the built-in functionality inside SolidWorks. Now, there's actually a few different ways that we can talk about mirroring entities. I'm going to use the first option here first, which is simply mirror entities. You're going to select the entities you want to mirror. In this case, I'll select all those original sketch entities. I'm going to use the copy option, and I'm going to select mirror about. I'm just going to select this line here. So you notice that what it does is it creates a copy of the original part, and it's mirroring it about this line. Now, if I move this, because this is underdefined, you notice that as the mirror line moves, the mirrored component moves as well. You also notice that 2 of the entities are black, but the rest of them are blue, telling me that it's underdefined. Now, the reason it's underdefined is because I don't have a dimension locating this part. Let's go ahead and just add a dimension, 225 millimeters. And even though this can be moved up and down, it doesn't affect the mirror, so now the mirror component is fully defined. You also notice some relations telling that it's symmetric. Now, this is basically taking this entity, making it symmetric about this line, making a new version over here. So that is a very handy tool. But there's another way that we can handle mirroring sketch entities. Let's go up to Tools. We'll go down to Sketch Tools and take a look at some of our options in here. Just below Mirror, there's something called Dynamic Mirror. Now, Dynamic Mirror is a pretty cool feature. In this case, we need to select the line that we want to mirror about. Once we do, we can start creating our geometry. In this case, I'm going to create a center rectangle. Once it's placed, you'll notice that the other version of it automatically pops up on the right-hand side. Now, this is the same for any geometry that we start to create. For instance, if we create a spline, it creates it over here. And of course, we can move these around on either side of the dynamic mirror line. So again, this is a very handy tool and allows you to do things like create mirrored components on the fly as you're sketching. Now, of course, it gets pretty interesting when you try to do things like connect these to each other, because we can't make that line symmetric because it crosses over that mirror line, that reference. But for the most part, that dynamic mirror option is a very handy one when you're creating your nice, smooth, organic sketches. The next thing we want to talk about is patterns. And to do this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete some of these components and simply leave this original rectangle that we created. Now, under patterns, we have 2 options. We have a linear sketch pattern and we have a circular sketch pattern. Now, I should note that there are many more options inside of the features dialog box. We can do linear and circular patterns inside there, but we also have curve-driven patterns, point-driven patterns, and we have equation-driven patterns, and then we have some very nice features where we can create the seed feature of an entire pattern that can be a circle or a square, rectangle, whatever the case is. But for now, let's focus on the sketch options. We'll start with linear. Now, when you open up a linear sketch pattern, the first thing that's populated is the x-axis for direction 1. Then you have a few options in here. We can dimension the x spacing, we can display instance count. Let's go ahead and make 5. And for spacing, let's do 150 millimeters. Now, as we scroll down, we need to select the entities that we want to pattern. Let's go ahead and select these lines. And you'll notice that it creates a pattern of 5 rectangles. Now, we also have the option to do this in Y as well. And by default, it's giving us the number 1 for the instance count. But if we make 5 in that direction, dimension the Y spacing, and we give it a new dimension, we can go ahead and increase that value as well. In this case, let's say 125. So now we made a pretty nice rectangular pattern of our sketches. Let's go ahead and say OK. One thing you'll notice is that all of the entities are blue. Now, this happens quite a bit, and one thing you'll notice is that they're free to sort of float around. Now, in order to fix this, you notice that there is a construction line here, and it's giving us the spacing, 150 millimeters, the instance count, the number 5, and then this line right here. If we simply select this line, make it horizontal, it's going to lock all of the horizontal entities. Now, if we do the same thing for the vertical one, go ahead and make that vertical, now we have a fully defined pattern. This is something that often gets overlooked when people start creating sketch patterns. You need to make sure that your sketch patterns of your original are still fully defined as well. Let's go ahead and undo this pattern, and let's take a look at the other option. Circular pattern is a very nice feature when you want to create things like bolt patterns or anything that has a circular reference. The first thing we need to select is the parameter to actually revolve about. So I'm going to select the origin point. Next, you'll notice that there are some dimension values, there's an angular value, and then there's some options here. Before we get into that, let's select the entities to pattern. So you'll notice as I select these lines, it's pretty interesting. It's taking these lines and it's basically rotating them about, and we're creating that rectangle in another, essentially, orientation. If we make 2 instances, you'll notice it looks like nothing happens. That's because we're traveling 360 degrees and we're making 2 instances. It's basically overlaying them. If we change this to 180, you notice that it does the same thing because we've essentially taken this and simply flipped it upside down. But if we go intermediate, 90 or 270, we're basically taking the original shape and rotating it 90 degrees. Now let's go back to that original reference point, and this time let's select this corner. So now as we select this corner, let's say 360 degrees, and let's do 4 instances. So you notice those 4 instances now get patterned around. Let's say OK. Now, this might be hard to see and understand with rectangular references, so let's do another quick option, and let's create a circle. Now, the circle at the origin, the size doesn't really matter. We're going to create a second circle, and we're going to create a small rectangle in here. Now, for this example, the dimensions don't really matter. We're going to go ahead and do a circular pattern of that rectangle, as well as the circle about the origin. We're going to increase the instance amount and take a look at the results. Now you'll notice inside of our options, we have equal spacing, dimension radius, dimension angular spacing, and display instance count. These are all very handy options depending on what you want to do. All the way at the bottom, there's also an instance to skip. When you select this, you can come in and you can turn off certain instances, in this case, every other instance, and now we can make an irregular pattern. Let's go ahead and say OK and take a look at what we have. Now you'll notice here everything is underdefined because we didn't define our original sketch, but that does give you a little bit of freedom to move things around. Let's go ahead and move this around as well. And you can see sometimes making these circular patterns with underdefined sketches can be very handy to help you visualize your concepts. There are many more options in here, and I really urge you to go ahead and play with them and see if you can figure out if they're going to be useful for you. Scale entities can be very handy, but in most cases you can simply redimension your object and not have to worry about scaling it.